welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today I'm in Venice, Italy, and I'm doing a little comparative, compare and contrast between Venice and the Venetian in Las Vegas. So let me take you around for that comparison today. Yeah, so as you can tell from the sheer number of tourists here, people selling selfie sticks and the like, we're on the Rialto Bridge. And so one of the things I wanted to point out here is the fact that with the Venetian in Las Vegas, obviously this is one of many iconic places in the city of Venice that is recreated for the guest. And of course the point is that, going back to theme parks, you have to have iconic structures or symbols that are memorable to the guests, and so it makes sense that you would want to reproduce or recreate particularly iconic places or iconic images or symbols of a site, so that those memorable moments then get transferred over through the reproduction, in this case of the Rialto Bridge. And it's certainly interesting to see it in Venice, and just to think about how different the energy and dynamism is and so forth. But one thing that is, of course, similar is the fact that so many tourists are here, and so it makes a sense if you think about sort of the mana that can be transferred, the power that can be transferred from one place to another. Since this is so popular with tourists, it makes sense, A, to try to reproduce or simulate Venice, and then B, to use a site like this, because along with some of the other, the Bridge of Sighs and the Campanella Tower just down the way, these are also iconic places that have memorable histories attached to them, and thus it's important to offer these to guests in the recreated versions at the Venetian. Okay, so as I work on giving you a comparison between the Venetian, Las Vegas, and Venice, Italy, I'm including then some of the video I shot on site in Venice, also some of my images and video I shot from the Venetian. And again, I want to suggest in this video that it's important to not think of the strict notions of originals and copies by any means. But I wanted to look at some of the key comparisons that we might make. And the first of these would be the Rialto Bridge. You see here an image, and I'm giving you the attribution of it. I didn't get a chance to take an original image on my own because it was under renovation during my visit. That's shown in Venice on the left, and on the right is my image from the Venetian. Obviously, you're going to notice here that some key changes. I think you can see that it's a rather cleaned up version in the Venetian, maintaining certainly the architectural form from what we can tell. And then on the left, you obviously see that you have water going under in the case of Venice, and on the right, because of issues of traffic flow and parking. You know, the ironic thing, right, in Venice is that there aren't cars allowed, and so that's obviously one difference. When you have the Vegas version, you do need to think about cars and taxis and airport shuttle buses getting in and out. So that's one clear change that quite obviously has to be made in the Venetian version of the Rialto Bridge. Okay, and here then is another perspective of the Venetian version of the Rialto Bridge. You can see here from a lower angle, and again, the whole point is that you have to flow traffic in and out of the casino into the parking spaces, and so the version of the bridge here then is repurposed for the purposes at hand of the casino in Vegas. Okay, another point of comparison we can make between these two places is found at the Bridge of Sighs, and you see a Creative Commons image here on the left, bridge dating from the 1600s, and on the right you have the version at the Venetian. And interestingly enough, in the 19th century it was named the Bridge of Sighs because the suggestion was that its use was prisoners were taken across this bridge to the prison area, and they would sigh because this is the last view that they would see of the city of Venice. And I think it's kind of interesting then that, you know, there are these different contexts that different architectural places have, and when we remix them and repurpose them in a new space like in Venice, presumably some of that context is lost and a different one is attached to it. In the case of Venice, in the Venetian version, its charm, its romance, its enjoyment, its entertainment, and the like. Okay, and as we continue the comparison, again, we should keep in mind that one of the dangers, I think, in even making this comparison that we're doing here is that we're assuming something about authenticity and originality that maybe isn't the case. Here is the famous Doge's Palace that you see on the left in Venice, on the right the Venetian version. And as you can see from the claims of the Venetian, they really have done something I think quite remarkable in terms of a form of remaking or a form of reproduction. Another thing I should note, and I'll maybe show you some video of this later, is on the left, if you didn't have some of that detail, you might think you were in Vegas just because of the sheer number of people. When you go to the top sites in Venice, you certainly are encountering thousands and thousands of tourists. So it's not certainly unlike what we might see in terms of tourism in Las Vegas at the Venetian. And in that sense, let me show you this next slide here. You could see here back at St. Mark's Plaza, looking at Doge's Palace, you get this marker here in different languages, and certainly an indication of the tourism that's present in this part of the city, which is just crawling with tourists. So again, I think it's important to remark on the fact that it's a fact of any place in the world in terms of the encumbrances that you deal with of tourists, and this is certainly the case that I discovered when visiting Venice in Italy. And this is another shot here of the cruise ships that come in and the gondoliers. There's a clear construction of tourism going on, right? And even if the gondoliers and the gondolas themselves are traditional, they're part of an overall tourist construct that cannot be, I think, separated from the background there, in which we see the cruise ship coming in, which is among the many cruise ships I happened to see that day during my visit. And of course we have the Campanile Tower here in St. Mark's Square. Very iconic. If you read about it, certainly some would say it's maybe the most iconic symbol in the city. And I mentioned in another part of this video that this makes sense that the Venetian takes this version, remakes it. Again, you can see the color is a little bit different, the construction is a little bit different, but essentially preserves the symbolism of the feature such that it will have that recognizability for the guest, for the tourist. And so this is, I think, a key part of theming, is that you are going to play off iconic symbols and use them to create evocative spaces and things for the guest in that space. And of course, when we're doing a comparison to the Venetian, right, we can't leave out the gondoliers here, as we see in Venice. And certainly we could say that the performativity of the gondola and the gondoliers is a key aspect of recreating the ambiance in the Las Vegas simulation. Okay, and I think as we take a look here, on the left we have Venice, Italy. On the right we have the Venetian. One of the things that is very clear for both cities, for both versions that we're looking at in this feature, is that the gondolas and the gondoliers are very important to the tourism, very important to creating the sense of charm that all of us as tourists, as guests, associate with either of the spaces. I actually checked on a gondola ride in Venice there on the left, and it was very, very expensive and certainly out of my price range, but that's, I think, part of the construct of tourism that we see in the city. And then on the right, in terms of thinking about the Venetian, the same thing, the difference being that the charm has a different approach, or there's a different approach to the charm. Again, you can see here on the left, kind of a crowded canal here with two gondoliers and a boat trying to make its way through, with presumably tourists on both sides. And on the right, we also have a crowded canal, a little less crowded, also with tourists in the case of the Las Vegas version. But the charm in the Vegas version, I think, is much different for the fact that you're in a much smaller space, you can't take a tour of the city, and you lack some of the things that you would get if you did a gondola tour in Venice itself. So there's certainly comparisons to be made, similarities and differences in both of these cases, but the charm is obviously a big key here in terms of the ambiance in both cities. And so one of the things they do in miniature form in the Las Vegas version, right, of Venice is you get in the shopping area, in the canal shops, you get something very similar to this, and I think you might be surprised to see that indeed in Venice there are bridges over the canals that are as miniature or small as at least one of the ones I can recall at the canal shops in the Venetian Las Vegas. I tried to dig up some video of that. Unfortunately, I didn't have a lot, but again, you can see the comparison there. This very narrow canal on the left in Venice, as the camera goes skew there. And then on the right, we were looking at the Venetian version in Vegas, and then I'm actually walking back over the bridge. So the point I wanted to make was it's not unprecedented to think that, you know, some of the recreations in the Venetian version are so different than what we get in the Venice version in Italy. So at this point I wanted to do another comparison, and I'm going to show you in a second here some footage I shot a number of years back at the Venetian in Las Vegas, talking about just the perspective that's created in terms of the decor and architecture, and you'll see some of the key features, so it's useful. And then in the second clip, I'm walking down a very narrow street in Venice, Italy, discussing how some of the features, such as this narrow street and all its ambiance, cannot be recreated in a themed casino like the Venetian. So let's look at both of these clips. So we're back here sort of at the, I guess, mezzanine right before we enter the Grand Canal shops at the Venetian. And one of the things you can see is that people are alongside here taking photos. What they've done effectively is they've created vistas. I talk about vistas at points in the Immersive Worlds Handbook. And you can see here that I can just pan here, walk along this mezzanine area, and really see incredible views of the Strip and also incredible views of the theming. I think what the Venetian has done so effectively is they've spread the theming out, they've established continuity, much like Caesars, but Caesars does this more in the interior space, but in the exterior, the Venetian is incredibly effective in terms of creating almost thematic vistas, where any guest can move from one space to the next and really see the dramatic architecture, the theming, and the nuance and so forth. And it really goes, I think, a long way in terms of establishing credibility with the guest. So that is just striking to me that you can't reproduce in a casino. It's just as you're walking through the streets, and you get this sense of, again, that ambiance, just how narrow the streets are. You can maybe get a sense here just looking at my hands and how incredibly thin the streets are here. So jumping back to some of the literature from the Venetian in Las Vegas, this is from 2015, and you can see here that they are not at all embarrassed about the remaking that they're doing in terms of taking and riffing on and resampling Venice, Italy. And so here, obviously, they're trying to talk about the fact that you can see all the architectural marvels of Venice here in Las Vegas. As it says at the bottom here, it lists all the features. Many of these we've talked about, some I won't cover today. But the bottom quote, right, is very important. See these inspirational sites in person at the Venetian Las Vegas and experience the heart of Renaissance Italy. And this is from a feature, as you can see at the bottom. You can click on that on the website, which allows you to explore the architecture of the Venetian. So it's certainly something that is highlighted in full when you visit the Venetian in Las Vegas in terms of this charm of Italy that they're recreating for the guest. Okay, I'll show you two more clips here. This is just some voiceover. I already addressed this in the video today, but I'm outside of St. Mark's Square here at Doge's Palace, talking about the architecture and how it's been recreated in the Venetian version. Again, you can see very crowded with tourists, and certainly this wasn't a busy day, but still quite busy. And now here we are, thousands of miles away in the Nevada desert, the Las Vegas version, and I'm just showing you some of the canal shops. Again, for me, I think that the canal shops do capture some of the essence, some of the charm of the version that we get in Venice, Italy. And equally crowded, and again, very narrow streets, and certainly a much smaller space. But when I'll show you some of the images, or rather video later, of walking into the main plaza of St. Mark's Square, and it's not unlike the Vegas version in terms of all the shops there. So I think we'd be amiss to say, well, the consumer's version is the one that is in Las Vegas. In fact, I would argue that, like many other cities in the world, New York, San Francisco, Paris, Venice has become a city that is marked by its tourism and its consumerism. So food for thought today here in Las Vegas. So actually this is a shot just before you walk into St. Mark's Square in Venice, Italy. And again, it looks like something you might see in the city of Las Vegas at the Venetian. So I want to show some video here, and I want to compare and contrast these narrow alleyways of shops that the guest sees before he or she enters St. Mark's Square. On the left is the version in Italy, going through the narrow passageway with all kinds of trinket and souvenir shops, some high-end shops. And then on the right, I'm already in the square there. But that is you know, very similar experience in terms of walking through a very narrow alleyway, and then you see the square. Of course, the difference is in the Venetian version, you're indoors with simulated clouds, and in the Venice version, you have what appears to be, from what we can tell, the real sky. So let me then do a bit more of this comparison. I want to give you the voiceover of that clip that I just showed you from Venice. So that'll be the first clip. And the second one, I will also include the voiceover. It's an old clip from a take on this same square and entryway from Venetian Las Vegas. Okay, so we'll take the walk here into San Marco Square, and I think if there's a place that is iconic, you know, again, these kinds of sites we've been talking about throughout the video of the Venetian, it is this square, and again, you just see the remarkable ambiance here and what it represents, and you can see certainly why so many people are taken with the Venetian and certainly Venice itself. Shops and eventually the casino. And for me, that's an important side of this, is that sense of establishing with the guest connections from one space to the next. And we're coming up upon here, I think one of the more dramatic spaces for me inside the Grand Canal shops. And if you look, let's just actually step back here. If you look at this, so we're using perspective and space. We're going from this, you know, rather narrow space and low ceilings to a grand plaza. Quite dramatic. We see here, and you can't, I wish I could capture this with a wide angle lens and you could see the true expansiveness of this, but it's quite astounding. I mean, it's astounding to think that we can do this inside casinos, use theming in such a way that guests upon guest, you know, they're snapping pictures away, they're taking remembrances of their trip to the Venetian and using them for important points of memory in their lives. Okay, so again, this is some historic footage I shot showing you now inside the area of St. Mark's Square. This is, I think, you know, again, one of the more dramatic features at the Venetian, and it's a public space. Again, the comparison to the Venice version is that this is indoors and certainly much, much smaller, but they've done, I think, a lot here to create charm and to also create a social gathering space. And this is well before the movement in Las Vegas of creating the large outdoor malls, which also rely on this sense of space and sociality. Let me show you some actual then footage here with the sound included. So again, it's just giving you a sense of the social experience. And here now is my Venice video. And one of the things to note is if you've been to the Venetian in Las Vegas, their version of the square, as you can see here, much smaller, right? And for obvious reasons. But I think certainly what they've done in terms of recreating the space, they've given us the major symbolic associations, place associations, building associations. Okay, we're looking here again at some of my historic footage of the Venetian in Las Vegas. I think that's quite obvious. You can see all the other casinos in the background, and actually it reminds me of a point I want to emphasize in this next section. I want to focus on, for lack of a better term, distractions that we might see in both the Venetian version of Venice and the Venice-Italy version of Venice. Distractions in terms of consumerism or tourism, and I think these are things that really would help to relativize the two spaces, again, to point out that we should no longer think of originals and copies in terms of Venice, Italy being some sort of original and the Venetian Las Vegas being some sort of copy. Okay, and in this regard, we can look at here side by side the left Venice, Italy, the right, the Venetian, Las Vegas. Again, I don't know if you were an art historian or a person trained in classics, you might be able to tell the difference. So I keep suggesting, you know, we shouldn't be so obsessed with this notion of the original and the copy. Certainly both versions, I think, are interesting in their own perspectives, and both, I would say, have flaws. And in terms of thinking about flaws, we might first look at the Venetian in Las Vegas here. And I was actually looking for some images. You can see on the bottom of the screen, you have one of the ubiquitous Hot Babes direct-to-you trucks. So, you know, the fact that you have so many of these distractions around you while you're spending your time at the Venetian trying to experience some of the charm of Venice and relaxation and excitement, you know, you have to think about all those distractions there that constantly remind you you're at a casino. And certainly the fact that you see images like this, right? You have video screens everywhere that suggest to us that indeed we are perhaps in a casino, we're in a consumer space, and it's something certainly to think about in terms of your experience in that theme space. And in this regard, I pulled up this video. This is actually in Milan, Italy, so not in Venice, but maybe you can make out here. These are windows with video screens, and I shot this on my cell phone and hence the bad quality. But as you can see, you have this very historic building and you have these video windows, which to me suggests something of how historic places that are known for perhaps their heritage are even becoming more consumerist by the day. And here then we're back in Venice, and you can't probably make them out, but during my visit, the entire St. Mark's Square here experience was predominantly, I think what I remember the most was not the sights, but all the people selling selfie sticks and flowers and other things of this nature. So it was really highly consumerist in nature. And here, very near the train station, is a Burger King. And I also found this to be interesting because it suggests something about, you know, you have a consumer branded space like Burger King, and it is in a sense being rethemed. The logo's maintained, but the facade maybe fits in a little bit better than a garish site like a typical Burger King that you might see in other cities that are not trying to play off of their heritage and their history so much as Venice, Italy is trying to do. Yeah, and so I guess I would say, you know, if there's one thing that the Venetian in Las Vegas has captured, again, is this performativity, the symbolic, gondoliers. In some ways, it's kind of funny, right, when you see it recreated in Las Vegas, because of course, you know, everything is in miniature form, and even, you know, the gondola ride is much less spectacular. So again, yeah, I guess you have to think through the symbolic aspects of it and not think about it in the literal sense. And I think the literal sense is what gets each and every cultural critic wrapped up in the problems of you know, making the clear association between an original and a copy. And of course, the whole point is not to necessarily think of the original and the copy, but instead to think about the symbolic properties and essences and the idea of mana, and taking that from a place and seeing if then you can imbue that into another space. And that's essentially, I think, what has been done in Las Vegas to great effect. Of course, to many cultural critics, even making the comparison such as this would be considered blasphemy, right? Because the whole point is that they want to maintain this notion, the strict notion of the original and the copy. And even since Walter Benjamin and his famous work of art piece In the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, we've, I think, come a long way and realized that indeed the mana that is lost here and transported to Vegas is significant. But thinking about mana even here, what's in the background here, right? There's a cruise ship in the background, and we have the gondoliers here. So there's a melange, a pastiche, whatever you want to call it. I think any contemporary tourist site like Venice has a very postmodern quality to it because you have such an assemblage of different things in one space. So it's a very happy assemblage of the gondoliers, behind them a cruise ship, right? So in a sense, the juxtaposition works because over time, tourism has transformed our landscapes, and thus we become, excuse me, more and more familiar with seeing sites like this and not being jarred by them, not seeing them as uncanny or something like this. But I guess I would say in the Vegas version, everything is miniaturized, everything is more symbolic. Okay, I wanted to take this opportunity now to focus on what I think is an influential text in terms of making this comparison that I'm doing today between aspects of Venice and Italy and the Venetian Las Vegas. And this is Giovanna Franci's book, Dreaming of Italy, Las Vegas, and the Virtual Grand Tour. And I think this book, maybe underread, is for me very influential because it's trying to do some of the paralleling that I'm talking about in this particular video. And I really do recommend this book, which was published by the University of Nevada Press. And it not only looks at the Venetian, it also considers Caesars in Las Vegas and also the Bellagio. And I wanted to show you just some of the pages from the text because I think the comparisons again are quite stunning. The photography is very good, and then she has a very interesting analysis of making the comparisons. And I think some of it is surprising because of the fact that she is wrestling with this idea of authenticity and the original and the copy, and something that I'm talking about throughout this video. So as an example, and I'll try to put it in the second camera here, this is a comparison of one of the murals, the Apotheosis of Venice, that you see in Venice, and then so the Venice version is here, and then this is the Venetian version, just to show you how she's making these side-by-side comparisons. And I think it's quite important to remember that even though people are concerned about the fact that you've copied a place, and the same thing has come up, for example, with Hallstatt, where a copy was made in China, and actually they reversed the town, they sort of flipped things. And I had heard some interviews by locals in Austria who said they were quite upset. And Franci mentions in this book that when the designers of the Venetian went to Venice, the mayor at the time refused to meet with them because he was also concerned about this idea of copying something and how ludicrous it is to copy something. You have to remember, I think, what's going on in the Venetian version is trying to take some of the essences, the charm, maybe even some of the authenticity, ironically enough, and to transport that in a much smaller space. And I think that's something maybe lost in some of the criticisms of the Venetian and other themed casinos in Vegas or other places around the world that have some close, if not almost, exacting resemblance to some originals out there in the world. And that certainly is the case, I would say, with the Venetian. Here's another example on page 65, looking at the Campanella Tower in 4 different versions. Sort of the original version, and then when it collapsed, the new version of it. So this is, I'll show you on this camera, that historic version, and then down here we have the copy, if you will, in Venice, and then here is the version in Las Vegas at the Venetian, and then interestingly enough another version created in Denver, Colorado. And so this idea of riffing, I think if you look at the work of DJing, you start thinking about how you can sample something and remix that. In other work I've called this cultural sampling, where basically you take something that has a previous location, I won't say original location, and you remix that in a new place. And so I think if you think about electronic music or the visual arts, there's a lot of influence, what Bloom calls the anxiety of influence, this idea that in the past people have done things and you have to respond to that, and you often do that through citation. In 2015, there's certainly in the United States there's been a lot of focus on cultural appropriation. You had the Rachel Dolezal case in Spokane, Washington. You have Iggy Azalea and some of her work in terms of recreating classic forms like Bollywood and taking a new spin on it, or even her own rap genre. Some people have called that cultural mimicry or inappropriate forms of cultural appropriation. So these are age-old questions, and I think sometimes they get more dramatically played out in a place like the Venetian, Las Vegas, when in fact we should be saying this is part and parcel of the human experience, going back hundreds and if not thousands of years in terms of thinking about copying and riffing and appropriating and remixing and so forth. So I think a lot to be said about it. There are additional, I was going to show you some additional comparisons here, and actually this was something I wanted to read to you. She mentions here on page 120 that to translate the spirit of Venice as closely as possible, the committee that created the Venetian visited the Italian city a number of times so they could reproduce the monuments down to the smallest detail, just taking off some of the patina of time. And here's a quote from about Sheldon Adelson, of course, the famous entrepreneur. "No property anywhere in the world has been reproduced with such authenticity and in such excruciating detail." And I found something from 2015 that I'll show you from the Venetian's website that talks about this. And so they're still indeed focusing on this in terms of trying to say, let us, come to our casino because it has the charm of Italy, and we didn't spare any expense and we didn't miss any details. So here's some further examples, and unfortunately my trip to Venice was quite short, and so I have some comparisons. For example, here I was able to get the Rialto Bridge and do that comparison, but there are many other places that were taken, if you will, and remixed from Venice in the Venetian version that I didn't have a chance to visit. And these are just a few more examples of it. And I think it's kind of obvious here, right? Because it's cleaned up. At the top then would be a version, and I'm not saying the original, a version from Venice, and then this is the next version from the Venetian. And again, there could be a third version of this, or a fourth, and likely there are other versions out there that we are not even aware of because of the nature of remixing. The Venetian, I think, is quite unique in that it is trying to pay some homage to Venice. Other casinos, of course, New York, you could say it's a much more theatrical or stagecraft approach to copying or remixing than we see in the version of the Venetian. And then here's another example of another comparison she does. Venice here, and then this is the Venetian version. And so I think, and again, I encourage you, there's many other examples here, and actually beginning on page 120 or so is where you get a lot of these side-by-side comparisons, which again I find to be very enlightening to think about the level of authenticity that was attempted, I think. And here's more versions of it, different statuary and figures and architectural and design details that were, whatever word you want to use, ported or remixed from Venice and then redone in the Venetian version in Las Vegas. So I wanted to mention this important book, Dreaming of Italy, and I think if you want further information and to conduct some of your own analyses of the sort that I'm suggesting in this video, again, I really recommend this book because it has so many insights to offer, and the photos themselves I think are quite unique and evocative in terms of some of this analysis. So be sure to check this out if you intend to look at this in more depth. So as I close this comparison today of the Venetian Las Vegas and Venice, Italy, I take one more trip down here. Canal, very relaxing boat ride on a water taxi, looking at some of the sights here in Venice, Italy. And I hope in this video feature I've given you some new insights about what exactly happens when we go about the difficult and challenging task of trying to recreate place in a new place, remixing it in various ways as we see at the Venetian Las Vegas. Hope you enjoyed this video feature today here in Venice, Italy, and please come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.